Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. We're going to have a great show. We're going to have my good friend Nick Redfern talk about his new book, Monster Files. But Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com. It can be heard live every Thursday evening from 8 to 10 p.m. here on the Inception Radio Network. So if you've been listening to the show for a while or are a new listener, you probably have heard commercials for the Institute of Applied Energetics, which is a training program that I developed to teach people to work as a medical intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner. And we decided to do a summer go back to school blowout sale. And so if this is something you have been playing around with, changing careers, get more training, move forward, get out of that boring dead-end job, please do go to www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com and check out the training program that's offered, because the savings only happen once a year. Anyway, a couple of other things. If you've missed an episode of Just Energy Radio, you can always go to our website, www.justenergyradio.com. And I was just looking at it, and, we're going to be talking to Nick. And on that website, you can check out the 5 other interviews that we've had with Nick about all of his other books. All right. A small portion of all of his other books. But there are over 6 years worth of archives on the site. You can listen to the show on YouTube, on our Just Energy Radio YouTube channel. If you go to the website or go to YouTube, if you would please subscribe to our newsletter or to our YouTube channel, we would really appreciate it. Or you can come here to the Inception Radio Network and listen to the shows live. You can listen to the archive on the website, or you can download the Android app and listen on your smartphone. So you can take me and the rest of the Inception Radio shows with you everywhere you go. How cool is that? A couple of announcements about upcoming events. If you are in the Fort Wayne, Indiana area, in September is going to be the Ancient Mysteries Conference. I was supposed to go there, but had to back out in the last minute. But it's going to be a great show. It's featuring Stan Friedman and Ed Markowski and Heather Lynn. It's going to be a lot of really good people at that conference. But also in September, and this is September 21st, in Oklahoma, I'll be speaking at the Paranormal Times Paracon in, I want to say Oklahoma City, but then they told me it was like an hour from Oklahoma City, but around Oklahoma City somewhere. And, probably the day of the event, I'll find out where I'm actually supposed to be, because that's how it usually ends up. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about Nick and get him on the air. Nick Redfern is the author of many books on UFOs, aliens, Bigfoots, werewolves, the Loch Ness Monsters, paranormal phenomena, conspiracy theories, psychic powers, and this is my favorite, Hollywood scandals. His titles include Contactees, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, The Covert Agenda, Strange Secrets, Three Men Seeking Monsters, The FBI Files, Celebrity Secrets, Cosmic Crashes, There's Something in the Woods, Science Fiction Secrets, On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, Body Snatchers in the Desert, and Man Monkey, and then his newest book, and that's not even listing all of his books, Monster Files. And so please welcome to Just Energy Radio my good friend Nick Redfern. Hey, Nick, how are you?
Hey, Rita. I'm doing good, thanks.
Well, thanks for coming on the show today. You know, I was looking on, the archive page, and it has been a whole year since you've been on the show.
Well, it doesn't seem that long. Probably because I bumped into you at that conference. Was it the one in Waxahachie?
Well, there was the one in Waxahachie, but I also saw you in Jefferson. So we did see each other a couple times this past year. But, but I've kind of traditionally seen, because you're always coming out with new books every week. I try to catch up, every 6 months. And I looked and I'm like, dang, it's been a whole year. Wow.
Yeah, that's wild.
That is wild. So, this book is an interesting mix of kind of all of your different talents and, areas of expertise. But it's kind of talking, the title talks about monsters, so I'm going to kind of approach my question from that angle. And I'm going to put my glasses on so I can actually read my own notes, which has been a little challenging lately. But when people think of cryptozoology, they think of Bigfoot, the chupacabra, the Monitor monster, Loch Ness monster. And we know that at least at one point in time, because we're kind of talking about monsters and government here, that the government investigated UFOs. But what about these unexplained creatures? Has the government looked into them?
Yes, in one word. This is sort of a little bit of a departure for me because I've written 7 or 8 books on various aspects of cryptozoology over the years, but I tend to, or exclusively, write those books in sort of the way that the investigations were undertaken. That's to say, I sort of write them diary road trip style because it sort of reflects the investigations that I'm doing, whether it's at, Loch Ness or Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabra or wherever, But this one's a bit different because it's a study of government files. So where you're talking about it was sort of like a cross of my overall body of work, so to speak. This one deals with cryptids, but it's written in the way I kind of write my UFO books, which is an examination of the facts and the government files and so forth. And that's basically the format of the book. And I sort of essentially wrote it because nobody really written, a book on what the government, or governments, I should say, know about cryptozoology. And so I thought, why not bring it to the table and share the information?
Well, up until starting to read your book, my knee-jerk answer would have been nothing, because
yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't think that they would have, it's right up there with ghosts. It's just a figment of those crazy people's imagination. So it was a little surprising, shocking that there was any kind of interest at all.
Well, yeah, and you actually bring up a good point there, because everybody thinks of, official interest in UFOs. We know that's been going on. And, of course, remote viewing, psychic spying. That's the other area that agencies around the world have delved into for many, many years. Most people assume it sort of begins and ends with UFOs and remote viewing and ESP, not realizing that cryptozoology is a big part of it, which sort of begs the question, as you just brought up with ghosts, how many potentially other areas of so-called paranormal research might be actively being studied as well? It could be completely across the board. It's just a matter of, if we don't know about it or we don't apply for the files to be released, if we know they might exist, then we're not going to be any the wiser. Who knows? That could be... over the years, I've actually uncovered, totally unconnected to monsters or UFOs or psychic spying, but I've actually uncovered a number of official files and everything from witchcraft to out-of-body experiences and all sorts of stuff that was being researched. So it sort of really does suggest that maybe everything of a paranormal nature is being watched to some extent or studied.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you put cryptozoology and paranormal, because that's not really a connection that I would make, really.
Well, Yeah, well, it's not a connection that many cryptozoologists like to make, but I do. For me, cryptozoology, for people who aren't aware of it, is the study of unknown animals. Now, that would involve creatures like Bigfoot, the chupacabra, the Loch Ness Monster, and sea serpents, creatures that science doesn't acknowledge are existing, and biology and zoology certainly don't either. But some people place other types of animals in the field of cryptozoology. For example, in Britain, we have a lot of reports of big cats on the loose, or large cats that shouldn't be in the UK, sort of like the equivalent of mountain lions and black leopards. And there's nothing weird about these cats, but what's weird is that they're being seen in Britain. So some people consider those to be a category. Actually, a lot of researchers consider those animals to be a category of cryptozoology, even though they're not unknown. They're just in the wrong place to where they should be. And they become known as alien big cats, or ABCs. And then there's a third category that a lot of researchers really don't like, but which I find sort of pretty fascinating, and that's where you have some animals that appear to look like animals, but that seem to have sort of supernatural overtones to them, where so they look like animals in some respects, but they sort of vanish in a flash of light or fade away, or they're seen at the same time in the same location as other strange phenomena. And like Mothman, for example, when the Mothman sightings kicked off in the mid-'60s in Point Pleasant, you also had a lot of UFO activity, poltergeist stuff going on, people having strange prophetic visions, men in black turning up, and, of course, the Mothman. So that's another category that I think is related to cryptozoology, but other people might suggest, well, it's more of like a phantom creature, in which case perhaps it should just remain in the domain of supernatural research, not cryptozoology. So it's an area that has parameters, but sometimes they're sort of a little bit fuzzy and grey, so to speak.
But, when we talk about the concept of, creatures appearing and then disappearing, it makes me think of like interdimensional beings, which when you throw that concept out, it throws you potentially right into the world of UFOs, which would make you say, okay, so maybe there's a connection. Maybe the Mothman's getting off the ship.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's exactly that as simple as that, but I think a lot of these things, I actually do believe they sort of flit in and out of our reality. Now, I'll be the first to admit I'm not going to use sort of, over-the-top physics ideas and themes that I don't really understand, because I don't really understand them. But, I mean, things like quantum physics are today quantum physicists, I should say, are theorizing that there could be numerous multiple dimensions beyond ours. And if you know how to negotiate them, you can literally flip back and forth. And as I said, the science is highly complex, but that's, in essence, the simple description of it. So who's to say that some of these creatures may be flesh and blood animals, but if they can flit in and out of our reality to another realm, perhaps it's just that they appear supernatural because they vanish before our eyes. But maybe it's just a case of a flesh and blood animal returning to its realm and then coming back to ours again. And I often think that might explain the sort of here 1 minute, gone the next minute aspect that a lot of these cases seem to have attached to them.
That's a really interesting point. It just makes me think in mythology, you hear about the gods with the ability to become invisible, but even with them, they would have a special ring, or they would put on a cloak of feathers or some kind of a coat. There was some kind of device that they would use to make them be invisible.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these old myths, if you interpret them literally, obviously it comes across, it sounds like mythology. But if you sort of look at it from the perspective of it, mythology could be like a distorted history, and, a magical ring or something like that could actually be a piece of highly advanced technology, then we're sort of moving into a totally different realm then.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. One of the things that you talk about in the book is, you were talking about the Mothman, but aren't there some correlations between Bigfoot sightings and UFO sighting kind of things?
Oh dear, you don't want to bring that up, Rita. You'll have the cryptozoologists on your back in no time. But,
I don't care. They
no,
hammer me for everything. So,
Well,
and anyway, it's your book. It ain't my book.
Yeah, I don't care either because I've actually wrote a chapter in the book all about that. But yeah, but when it comes to Bigfoot, I guess the subject sort of polarizes people into two camps, and there is a third camp, which is the skeptics and the debunkers, but we don't talk about them, so we'll forget about them. But the two camps are the ones who think Bigfoot is some sort of like a regular animal, just one that's unclassified by science or remains undiscovered officially, but it's like a North American equivalent of a great ape that we still haven't formally identified or found. And then there's I'll admit it's a far smaller group of people who, like me, believe that yes, Bigfoot is 100% real, which I do. I'm not a skeptic or a debunker at all. I think Bigfoot is absolutely 100% real. But I sort of don't shy away from and actually veer towards investigating reports where there appears to be this sort of supernatural aspect to the stories where Bigfoot is often, well, it's not often, but there are reports. I don't think there's a researcher out there of the Bigfoot phenomenon, whether they agree with these stories or not, who hasn't got more than a handful of such cases, which, very, very strange rogue cases. I'll give you a classic example. As you know, I live in Arlington, just outside Dallas. Well, a few hours drive south, you can be down in the Big Thicket just outside Houston, which is this massive area of forest. Now, there's a road that runs through the length of the Big Thicket called Bragg Road. And locally, Bragg Road is known as Ghost Light Road because people report sightings of these strange balls of light flicking through the woods and zooming through the trees, very much all like the far more famous Martha lights of Texas. But what's interesting is that Ghost Light Road, Bragg Road to give it its official name, has actually been the site of a huge number of like hairy wild man and Bigfoot type reports. In fact, a friend of mine, Rob Riggs, who also lives in Texas, wrote a book called In the Big Thicket about 10 or 11 years ago, which is a study of all these ghost light and Bigfoot reports. So, sort of metaphorically speaking, on my and your doorstep, you can actually find reports where Bigfoot has been seen, not in the same location and time frame as sort of nuts and bolts type UFOs, but certainly weird aerial phenomena. And when you get reports like that time and again, I don't think it's the responsible thing to do to ignore them because you just think, oh, well, it's just a giant ape, so the person's got to be mistaken. I think the responsibility is on our part to actually investigate these cases.
I've never heard the stories about this Ghost Light Road. I like that name. But I think it's interesting that, in that part of, and I have to think about it, East Texas, we have the bog monster over there. We have all of this weird stuff, and they always associate Bigfoot with, the Pacific Northwest or the Himalayas, which you would think is a very forested area. And even though there are trees in East Texas, I don't consider it like this heavily forested area that things could hide all that well.
Well, I mean, the location is an interesting one as well, where these things are seen. I mean, there's no doubt that the Pacific Northwest and Bigfoot are always going to be sort of inextricably tied together because that is where we get a massive amount of reports. And you can go back to when newspapers were coming out in the 1800s and find stories of wild men of the woods over there and things like that. But there have been a substantial number of reports in the forested areas of Texas on the east side. And, I mean, people who sort of stick to the idea that it's just a flesh and blood animal take the view that possibly, or some of them do, take the view that these creatures might be sort of nomadic. And, as the seasons change and the landscape change and the food supplies change, they sort of migrate from place to place. So they're constantly on the move. Now, that in itself is intriguing because most great apes, they tend to live in sort of family groups and remain static. And that's why, unfortunately, it's for example, the Congo gorilla, is in a pretty rough state in terms of its potential survival in future years, becoming endangered because they're so easy to find, because hunters know where they live all the time. They have ready-made dens and colonies where they live. Whereas Bigfoot constantly seems to be almost like a loner and on the move, which again sets it apart from a regular ape. Now that might explain why, on the one hand, if it's a flesh and blood animal, we don't catch them, because they are on the move, and unlike most apes, they're very solitary. But on the other hand, it is a bit of a problem, particularly when Bigfoot is seen closer to home. I've got reports within 25 miles of Dallas, and of an 8-foot tall ape-like creature roaming around somebody's yard late at night. And when it's something like that to me is a little bit more problematic than something that's 40 miles deep in the Pacific Northwest woods where most people never actually go, Mm-hmm. So that's why there's this conflict, and you have two different approaches to the subject, because for me, at least, it can still go both ways. But in saying that, if you're going to go with just a physical angle, you've got to explain why we have these odd reports. It's not like people go to Africa and they see strange lights bobbing around Congo gorillas or whatever. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Or they don't find a colony of chimpanzees and see strange lights hovering over the woods. So why should there be any reports like that with Bigfoot if it's just a regular but unknown ape? There shouldn't be any, because other regular apes don't exhibit strange lights in the sky either. So, that's a conflict as well.
But even when you look at the physiology and relate physiology to intelligence, Bigfoot, you look at the footprints and they don't have a divergent toe, which means based on human evolution that they at least achieved kind of like an Australopithecine level of evolution, which were early tool users. And so you would think that even though they have a lot of hair on their body, it doesn't necessarily correlate to them being ape-like. They might be something much more than, animals.
Well,
in that sense.
No, that's actually a good point, because I think it's often our tendency as people to, we often make conclusions and assumptions based on appearance. And if you've got sort of a 7 to 8 foot tall creature covered in hair, and the closest thing you can apply it to in terms of what it resembles is a gorilla, you're going to perhaps think its brain power is on level with a gorilla. Now, gorillas are very smart animals, highly intelligent, but they're not quite up to our category, at least. They can learn sign language and talk to us in that sense. But there's a possibility, and I don't think we should ignore it, that Bigfoot could be a highly evolved creature, massively evolved, and that might have something to do with its skillful ability to avoid us. There are a number of stories in Bigfoot research where people have claimed that they have the ability and they're in the right place at the right time to actually shoot a Bigfoot. But when they looked at it, it seemed to have like eerily almost human, intelligent, kind of like spiritual almost, wisdom-based appearances to them that made the person think, well, hang on, it's almost like I'm going to be committing murder. And they've sort of backed off from shooting it. So that sort of does give rise to the theory, what if it's not just a giant ape? What if it's some sort of primitive but highly advanced human? Primitive in the sense that, ancient. We're Homo sapiens. Before us there was Cro-Magnon man, there was Neanderthal man, there are other ones way before that. What if there was one that we've actually missed, that nobody knows about and that evolved to a highly significant degree? And perhaps there are just remnants of them left now. But it would be ironic if in many respects they were our superiors, but maybe that is the case.
And then they're just laughing at us, those naked people running around.
Well, it's interesting you say about them laughing at us, because a lot of people do feel that when they're in the woods looking for these creatures and they're possibly in their terrain and they get a feeling they're out there, a lot of researchers do feel they've been manipulated by these creatures in the sense that, they kind of feel surrounded by them, as if the animals are the ones with the upper hand rather than the people. And there are cases where people have actually sort of felt, I guess the best way to describe it is kind of like as if the animals are able to sort of project and develop in the person like a sense of fear. They can sort of instill fear. And people are talking about potentially Bigfoot using infrasound. Infrasound is something that can actually destabilize the human nervous system and sort of cause all sorts of weird effects like dizziness and anxiety and things like that. And some researchers believe that Bigfoot has the ability to project infrasound to force people out of its area. And I've got a number of cases on file where people have been in the woods looking for Bigfoot, and they've suddenly felt this overwhelming sense of panic and sort of doom, and almost like their minds going, as if they're going, they're losing their mind, literally. And they leave the area, and it starts to fade away. And I've got a lot of reports like that, where it kind of sounds like these creatures might have the ability to actually project something that forces us out of their territory.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people in the more, I'm going to say the spiritual world, and I'll use like Michael Cremo. He touches on this a lot, or talks about this a lot, that talks about in our remote past that while we weren't developed in the material sense, we were very highly developed in the intuitive sense, in our ability to control and manipulate energy, our personal energy, our psychic abilities, and those things that exist in the subtle realm. And it kind of sounds like what you're talking about with Bigfoot might be that they still retain that characteristic that we've lost a long time ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we've lost it, but what I think...
Well, you know what I mean. We've doled it out of our brain as being impossible.
Yeah, I think what maybe these creatures have done is be able to fine-tune it. I mean, a classic example of us being able to do it is, I think everybody, probably, at least once every few weeks, you get this feeling that you're in a store or something, that someone's watching you, and you turn around and somebody's eyes are boring into the back of your head, you know what I mean? Everybody does that, where you just turn around, you've got that feeling, you lock on the person immediately, and they are looking right at you. Now, nobody really knows how we do that. We don't have literal eyes in the back of our heads. But to me, that is not coincidence. I think that is evidence of some, what we would call paranormal skill, but probably something that can be explained by science if we understood the science behind it. And I think that could be the case with something like Bigfoot, that he has the ability to fine-tune powers and skills that maybe we really did once have, and that occasionally they surface in all of us, kind of like when you're thinking of somebody you went to school with and then they phone you 2 days later, that kind of thing. And we don't know how to control it. It just happens at random for the most part. Maybe these things can turn it on and off.
For some people. I mean, that is what I do for a living, so, yeah.
Well, yeah, you can do. I mean, I'm just sort of...
I believe that everybody has that ability, and it's just more a matter of learning to tap into it, and so, yeah. Are there correlations between Bigfoot, Big Feet, Bigfoots, whatever?
There's a lot of controversy what it should be.
Those multiple, them Sasquatches, and like caves and underground dwellings?
Well, yeah, I mean, these are theories that have all been put forward in the past and certainly today. What if Bigfoot just doesn't sort of, sleep in the rough, so to speak, in the woods? The thing is with caves, I mean, that would be an ideal location, but if they were solely living in certain large caves, like in the Pacific Northwest, it would only take a couple of times to search them and to find the creatures if they were there. So that, again, kind of brings up the idea that if they're just flesh and blood and nothing else, they would have to be sort of more nomadic, I think. Now, again, tales of strange creatures living underground are sort of part and parcel of our entire world mythology.
And that's kind of where I was going. So,
yeah, I mean, in
talk
England,
away.
Yeah, exactly. It's like in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, there are stories from the 1500s of like goblins and the fairies. The fairy kingdom would be underground. You have stories from Death Valley in California about prospectors and people looking for gold stumbling on underground caverns that contain sort of ruined cities like something straight out of Indiana Jones, you know. And for some reason, now it doesn't mean none of these stories are true, but for some reason, there's like something in our psyche that is fascinated by the idea of underground secrets and, you know, that there are things going on under our feet and magical realms. And I think it's just something built in our subconscious, but possibly based upon like an inherited memory of something that's real. And so maybe these things do live or can live underground, you know, they know secret entrance points that we don't. I mean, that would perhaps help explain a lot, you know.
Well, actually, in a lot of those stories, you know, the person stumbles upon this cave opening and then something happens and they leave and they try to get back and they can't find it because it shut itself down. But it just made me wonder, you know, you have the stories of, you know, Dulce and the tunnels that connected to Area 51 and you know, these networks of tunnels that are beneath the earth all over the place. And it just, you know, makes my little connect the dot kind of mind go, well, maybe they travel in these tunnels from one area to the other. And that's why we don't really see them crossing, you know, through Chicago to get back to Washington.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, you know. I mean, maybe that is the case. The only thing I would say is that, I mean, what might be actually a good idea for people who are interested in pursuing that angle is sort of find an area close to them where there's been a lot of Bigfoot activity and don't go looking for Bigfoot, but sort of see if you can get local, like the city maps of where there are deep mines and that kind of thing, natural mines and natural caverns that maybe aren't sort of open to the public for tours, but are just, you know, hidden away wherever, and, you know, do some digging into those old caverns and see what turns up.
Yeah, good point. So one of the things that, you know, I saw posted on Facebook and I've talked to a couple of other people briefly about, but hadn't really gotten the skinny on. And since we're talking about Bigfoot, is that actually it was in Dallas. They were doing the genetic testing of some hair that was a suspected Bigfoot hair. Have you heard any information about the results of those tests?
Well, I'm not sure which one you're talking about specifically, but I mean, there've been various things over the last few years, and, you know, for the most part, it's come back as inconclusive, or in some cases, it's come back as just from another animal. But for the most part, where it's intriguing, it's still inconclusive. So, you know, I think
there was one that supposedly came out in December because it was, you know, I'm really good friends with Brian Forrester, the elongated head guy, and it was Quest Labs, I think, in Dallas, and they were doing testing on the elongated skulls, but his project got bumped because they were doing testing on some Bigfoot hair. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that was the actual lab, but yeah, I mean, for the most part, yeah, we do have hair in the same way that we have, you know, plaster casts of footprints that seem to show dermal ridges, which are like the fingerprints of the feet. So, you know, we have things that point in a certain direction, but we don't, whether it's hair, you know, whether it's prints, whatever, we don't have a definitive smoking gun yet. You know, we're still not able, even though some of these hair, you know, these hair samples are interesting, we're not able to stand up and say this definitely 100% comes from an unknown type of great ape. You know, if that happens, I'll be the first one to say, there is no paranormal angle to it. You know, I'll be happy to say that because we'll still have the answers, you know.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's, you know, indigenous to this planet, you know, or whether it's interdimensional or, you know, it just says that it's real. Realer than a ghost.
I mean, that's true. Yeah, it does leave the door open potentially to the idea that it's still weird in the sense that it's not from here, but it wouldn't mean it's not like some sort of strange phantasm or like an ethereal, ghostly creature. It would mean it's got physical substance to it.
Do you think, I mean, there are people that believe that the government's, you know, experimented with genetic engineering. Do you think Bigfoot might be some loose creature that has escaped from some genetic laboratory, or do you think that it's just a creature that is just really old and just hasn't been identified?
Yeah, if you want me to put it bluntly, I don't think there's a chance in hell of it being a genetic experiment. I think, there's today, certainly in today's world, I mean, things like gene splicing, joking aside, is sort of heavily regulated, and even because of what we can do today, the potential of creating sort of freakish hybrid creatures, and there are a lot of rules and regulations and laws in place to try and prevent sort of real-life Dr. Frankensteins from doing that. And certainly a lot of it's still in its early stages, but I mean, who knows, 20, 30, 50 years from now, it's been suggested that we could sort of create a race of dumbed-down sort of proto-humans that will do all the physical work, and we'll just sit back and do nothing, and there'll be like a sub-race of humans genetically modified and created to perform specific tasks. And that's what these rules are in place for, to try and prevent this sort of nightmarish sort of future Brave New World type situation from occurring. Now, if Bigfoot had just sprung up in the last few years, then, some people might say, well, perhaps these things are just something that sort of escaped from the lab. But, I mean, we have to remember that you can find reports in American newspapers all across the US of like hairy wild men and mysterious large apes running around in the 1800s. There are reports from the settlers when they first came over from England to the US of stories of hairy giants living in the forests and the mountains. So, certainly nobody was doing gene splicing and lab experiments in the 17 and 1800s. So I think, we can kind of rule that out. But, I mean, I'll be the first to admit that we can never really say what's going on in the labs today, trying to modify apes and humans. Who knows? I mean, although we look very different from chimpanzees, our DNA is more than 90% compatible, with identical with chimpanzee DNA. It's just the small percentage that makes us look and act so different. But for the most part, the DNA is not different. So who knows what could be going on in places where it's not supposed to be going on.
Well, I was reading this article the other day. Actually, it was on the news. We were flipping channels, and, it was the piece about Monsanto, my favorite company. And and they were talking about, and of course, the name totally made me laugh. And then I had to look it up because I was just horrified by it. Frankenfish. And I'm serious. That's what it's called. If you look it up online, it's Frankenfish. And it is a genetically engineered salmon that they mix with something and eel DNA so that it becomes bigger. And I'm like, really? So you're talking about humans and chimpanzees being 90% compatible. I'm like, salmon and eel?
Well, yeah, and this is, I'm sure this is something that we're going to see more of in the future. I mean, we have like genetically modified food, but it's like, well, what's wrong with a normal potato? Or what's wrong with a normal carrot? Why has it got to be genetically modified? And so, for that reason, I think we are going to see more of it as time progresses. And it's like any science. If it's used responsibly, that's fine. It's when it's used irresponsibly that the problems start. I mean, there's actually people have talked sort of in horrific circles, the idea that if we could start cloning organs, well, if somebody has a heart attack or they're born with a malformed heart and, a heart from, say, grown out of the mother's DNA, which is compatible then with the child or whatever, they could have a transplant and there would be no rejection issues or anything like that. But then people talk about the downside, where perhaps the rich would be the only people who could afford them, and they'd have a nice transplant every 20 or 30 years, and living to be 150, while the rest of us keel over at 85 or whatever. Still, so you've got things like that where science can be great, provided it's not sort of recklessly handled.
But then there's the whole other aspect that they tend not to look at, like with genetically engineered food, it's like, what's the long-term potential repercussions of us consuming it? So that's one part. But then I think, cloning body parts, on one level, I think it's a really cool thing. But then if you're using it to repair, genetic defects, then it runs into the whole thing of what are we doing to our DNA pool? If it's like, so in 200 years, everyone that's born has to have a heart transplant right away because the gene pool is so messed up.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, they're talking about now how, in a few years you'll be able to, have selected design a baby. What color eyes do you want? What color hair do you want it to have? How tall do you want it to grow to? That kind of thing. And that's when you're really getting kind of into very disturbing areas, almost like factory-created children, for want of a better term. And, of course, you're right. I mean, you only have to look at when dogs get inbred and things like that, and diseases and certain conditions start developing that affect the species. And a lot of it's just simply down to the fact that nature has ways of stepping in and preventing and stopping, if it's already started, these things from happening because it goes against the natural order. Now, as I said, that doesn't mean we've got to live like a bunch of Luddites and not use science. Of course we should, but we've got to realize that I think there's like a barrier that we shouldn't cross unless we're really fully aware of the implications of what will happen if we do cross that barrier.
It's a little scary, and in the moment, we won't notice it, but, do we really want to become a bunch of lab rats? I mean, because that's what
Well, no, we don't.
But I just feel like, with everybody taking Prozac, the chemtrail, Fukushima, I mein, all of this stuff that is going on in our environment that we're ingesting, willingly or unknowingly, what's happening and what impact is that going to have on us?
Well, what's happening? I mean, you talk about Prozac. I mean, I don't take any drugs. I don't take any pills because for me it's all nonsense. It's like, oh, you're having trouble sleeping? Well, take this. Are you having trouble waking up? Do you hate Monday mornings? Take a Monday morning syndrome pill. Well, everybody hates Monday mornings. You don't need a pill to put it right. You feel crappy on a Monday morning because everybody feels like that on a Monday morning, and it's like, are you having trouble sleeping? Are you depressed? Well, go on this medicine. Well, no, what you should be doing is finding out what's causing you to be depressed and take that out of your life. And then you don't need a pill. All the pill does is mask the effects. I don't take nothing, And if I get anxious about something, I figure out what's causing it. If something depresses me, I change the thing in life that's making me depressed. I refuse to sort of feed drug companies' pockets because they tell me I need to be on a specific medicine. It's very different if you've got blocked arteries and you need a blood thinner. That's different. But what I'm against is the pumping out and the demand that society needs to go on mood-altering drugs for their own good. People weren't on mood-altering drugs 30 or 40 years ago to the extent that they are today, and they're on them today because they're told they've got to go on them. And the side effects are so bad that when they try and come off, they can't get off them. They're as bad as the original thing. So that's why, I just live like I get up, I do work, I have a good time, and I don't worry about stuff,
Mm-hmm. And without, I want to move on because we have 5 minutes before break, but I'm just going to make one little comment. So I was driving home from my office one day, and there was a commercial, and I will never forget this, and it was a pill you could take for repetitive work syndrome. Repetitive work syndrome. So if you had a job that you were just doing the same stuff every day and you were, bored or whatever, that you could get this medication. It was on the radio, and I was just blown away. It didn't last very long, but I was just like, really? It's like you have a dead-end, boring job, and now you can take a pill to make it better. It just made me think of Brave New World. Here, get some Soma.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably just makes you feel a bit high, and you feel good when you're pressing the red button. Well, no disrespect, but I mean, we all have to work, and sometimes you don't have a choice in what job you take. But if your job is that repetitive and you hate it, don't take a pill. Try and find a job that you enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Because no pill like that cures anything. All it does is masks and buries the symptoms. That's all
Exactly. Okay, so we have like 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and I just want to cover this before, because I'm going to move in a totally different area. But and I touched on this, but has the government ever tried to genetically engineer some kind of creature for some reason and then covered it up?
Well, one government did, and that was the Soviet government back in the 1920s. Now, of course, back in the 20s, there was nothing like gene splicing, but a Russian scientist named Ilya Ivanov was actually officially funded by the Soviet government's Academy of Sciences because he had I won't call it an interest because that was the wrong term. It was actually a full-blown obsession with trying to crossbreed apes and humans. And as I said, he was actually funded by the Academy of Sciences to do this, and to the extent where he was able to put together a large team of scientists and workers to travel out to West Africa and capture a number of female gorillas and chimpanzees. And they were anesthetized, and a lab was set up where they could be taken, and they were impregnated with human male sperm to try and see if they could be crossbred. And he also set up laboratories in Russia and did exactly the same thing there. Now, officially at least, all the experiments failed, that they just didn't take. But there are a few rumours that, against all the odds, one or two actually did work, but they gave birth to sort of freakish, handicapped, mentally subnormal things that were sort of half human and half ape, and just totally against nature. And they just either were subnormal or they died. And that's often what happens when this occurs. A freakish thing's born, it just doesn't live long. So we know that the Russians officially did do it. Ilya Ivanov was a real scientist and known for experimenting in this field in West Guyana and Russia. But, as I said, the official story is it didn't work. The rumor is that maybe it did.
It just makes me think of the Sumerian stories where they talk about creating mankind, and it took them several tries with, this one couldn't stand up, and this one couldn't hold its urine, and this one couldn't reproduce, and them taking a number of experimentations before they actually created a viable human. Ooh, us. But Nick, I'm looking at the time, and we need to go to break, so I don't mean to cut you off. So, so the music should be coming up, I'm hoping. And I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Nick Redfern about his book, Monster Files. And we'll be back with Nick after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
You're listening to IRN, the Inception Radio Network, Chicago, Illinois.
Who were the gods of antiquity? They've been described as the forces of nature, levels of consciousness, and aspects of our psyche. Stories that depict their incredible weapons, their flying machines, and their amazing adventures are characterized as being the product of our ancestors' fanciful imaginations. But what if the tales of the gods are true? Did the writers, chroniclers, and scribes of our distant past actually document a realistic view of our origin? My latest book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, looks at our most ancient legends. Learn of the torrid romances, elaborate plots, violent scandals, and conspiracies that played out in antiquity. Find out the role the gods played in the life and culture we have today. If you want to find out the truth of who we are and where we come from, order your copy of Man-Made today. For more information, go to www.manmadethechronicles.com. That's www.manmadethechronicles.com.
You didn't forget what's coming up tonight, did you? Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Never miss that interview you were looking forward to or the show on your favorite topic. Follow IRN on Twitter, I_R_N, and get reminders about the evening's live shows as well as fun and important updates throughout the week. That's I_R_N, and never miss a great show again.
Move past the crossroads in your life and discover alternative solutions to your deepest concerns at soulhealer.com. So whether it's a physical problem, an emotional issue, a question about work, or troubles in your relationships, naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise can help you. Bring peace, harmony, and health back into your life. Schedule a session today. Visit soulhealer.com right away and live the life you've been dreaming of.
Hello, Inception Radio Network. Would you like your favorite show to be played again live on air? Well, now the choice is in your hands with IRN's live request portal, an easy way to request your favorite show with a simple click. IRN's live request portal now gives you exclusive access to all of the shows. How easy is it? Simply type a show name or a guest name, click request, even write a dedication message, and that's it. Try it now. Simply visit InceptionRadioNetwork.com, click on the Live Request tab under the show menu. Now playing your favorite show is just a mouse click away.
Don't have a computer? Is your internet connection down? Don't worry. Use your trusty landline or cell phone and dial or call and listen lines at 832-280-0830 or 786-837-2262 to listen to the Inception Radio Network 24/7. Again, those numbers are 832-280-0830 or 786-837-2262. For the Inception Radio Network, I'm MJ.
Go deep inside yourself and venture into the realm of the unconscious mind with my Meditating on the Kabbalah guided imagery audio CDs. Discover who you are and what you want in life. Meditating on the Kabbalah can help you to open, clear, and revitalize the energetic pathways of your subtle being. They will support you in your spiritual quest by helping you to access the profound insights and inner guidance you need as you work in alignment with your highest good. Let them help you to release negative thoughts and emotions and clear away any limitations that may be keeping you from experiencing your full potential. Walk down the path to health, healing, understanding, and enlightenment with Meditating on the Kabbalah. Order your copy today at www.soulhealer.com. That's right, that's www.soulhealer.com.
Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free.
Are you a fan of Inception Radio Network? Do you reckon it's the best alternative talk radio station on the planet? Well, if you do, head to facebook.com/Inception Radio Network and like the page. Tell your friends, spread the word, and keep listening to the best.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you can learn to become a medical intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner, all from the comfort of your own home. You know, there was one little announcement I forgot to make at the beginning of the show, but if you've been listening to the show regular, you know that in October I released my new book, Man-Made: The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, which has been doing really great. And Nick, I don't know if you heard this, but the book has been picked up by Red Wheel Weiser, Hampton Road Press, and they will be releasing it under their imprint and putting it into international sales and markets. Woohoo!
Wow, that's very cool.
That's very cool because they contacted me. I didn't even solicit them.
Oh,
so that was even better. So
Mm-hmm.
that was my excitement for this last week. But anyway, so we're here talking to Nick Redfern. His webpage is nickredfern.com about his book, Monster Files. I just found it so interesting, this whole little government part of the cryptozoology world. Again, it was not something that I would ever think of. Do you think that the government uses our beliefs and superstitions in things like Bigfoot or the chupacabra or, some of these other, or even UFOs to create a state of fear in us?
I've never come across any evidence to say they're creating a state of fear, but I do talk about a number of things in the book where monster legends have been used to try and frighten enemy troops, particularly where they're of a superstitious nature. For example, I talk about one case in the book where in the early 1950s there was an uprising in the Philippines by what were called the Huk rebels, H-U-K. And the Philippine government approached the American government and said, can you give us some assistance? And, America was happy to do so because the Philippines were friendly with the U.S. And one of the people who took a big role in trying to defeat the Huk rebels was a man named Major General Edward Lansdale. And Edward Lansdale was an expert in the field of psychological warfare, which is essentially trying to defeat or fool the enemy, not so much with guns and weapons and so on, or missiles or rockets, whatever, but by sort of trying to, sort of freak out their minds by using superstitions and folklore and bringing them to life and manipulating the mind rather than, a bullet in the body. And Edward Lansdale did a lot of research into the cultural superstitions on the Philippines and what specifically the Huk rebels were frightened of. And they found something called the Aswang vampire, A-S-U-A-G. And they weren't sort of like the vampires of today or, yesteryear, like black cloak people or, something like today's True Blood vampires, like a cross between Marilyn Manson and Nine Inch Nails or something like that. They're actually like vampiric monsters. They're sort of monsters that lived in the woods, but that acted in like a predatory vampire fashion. And when Lansdale realized that the Huk rebels were sort of petrified of these so-called Aswang vampires, he decided to bring them to life. And what he did, he had one particular, like a science and technology division, create this device which was designed to sort of mimic the two fangs of a vampire. And the idea was to capture one of the Huk rebels and kill him by shoving this device into the jugular vein and leaving two puncture wounds, and then hanging the body up by its ankles and draining it of blood, and then dumping it where the comrades would find the body the next morning and freak out because they thought their colleague had been killed by the Aswang vampire. And they literally fled the areas where every time Lansdale and his troops did this, the Huks would retreat further and further. And the result would be that more and more land and territory would be returned to the Philippine government. And it was all basically done as a result of this psychological operation involving monsters that actually never really existed.
Well, I really like that, need for high technology. I bet it costs millions of dollars, too, to make something that would puncture your jugular, really.
Well, I don't know. I think I could probably fashion something together from a few knives and forks, but, it was a bizarre operation. And Lansdale himself actually went public with it in the 1980s, and then spoke about it in the early 90s in his autobiography, and talks about how there was this liaison between the Philippines and his unit, and they created this device and punctured the wound on the neck and then hauled the guy up into the tree, sort of head first so the blood would drain out of him, and then stealthily replace the body. And it was sort of fascinating to read in his own words how you can actually defeat an enemy without firing a shot, and it actually works well under the right circumstances.
But I mean, that's using a cryptid, but I think, kind of going totally off topic here, that governments use maybe not that tactic, but other tactics to control and manipulate and use fear, don't go outside because, you're going to get kidnapped. And so now you have all these kids that won't go outside, or parents that won't let their kids go outside because they're afraid that somebody's going to get kidnapped or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do live in a state of fear. There's no doubt about that. And fear itself, is a controlling tool. But there's no doubt about that. It's kind of like parents say to the little kids, go to bed, or the closet monster will get you, because they want to have a bit of peace and quiet and alone time. It's kind of like that. I mean, from childhood to, to old age, fear can be used on any of us for any purpose, and it can work,
So, there are people that really get into the whole concept that there really aren't UFOs, but the government is using the smokescreen of UFOs to cover up their covert operations. And, people that are abducted are just actually abducted by, the men in black or whatever and taken onto a helicopter or something and then returned. Where do you kind of fit into that? I mean, do you think that that's a true statement? Do you think it's a mixture of, that it's possible that there's government involvement? Where do you fit in that whole thing?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there's a genuine UFO phenomenon, which is nothing to do with us, by us, I mean the human race at all. And the reason I say that is because you can go back particularly to the 40s and find reports of highly advanced, what seem to be like highly advanced, intelligently controlled vehicles performing all sorts of fantastic maneuvers and speeds. Now, if we as a species had that technology in the 40s, I don't see any logical reason why we wouldn't have used it, like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the various wars in the Middle East, wherever. I think we would have unleashed that technology just to say, hey, look, this is what we've got. I don't see why it should be hidden when, if the atomic bomb, the power of that, and everybody knows about it, why shouldn't it be admitted that we've got this device that can do left and right-hand turns, at 2,000 miles an hour back in the 40s or the early 50s? So that leads me to believe there's a genuinely unknown phenomenon. However, I mean, it is a matter of historical fact that a lot of highly advanced aircraft, like the U-2 spy plane and the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter, they were actually flying years before they were officially acknowledged as existing. And, of course, if you saw one of these before it was announced and reeled out of the hangar, so to speak, you might well think you'd seen a UFO. So I'm pretty sure that in latter days, certainly since the late 70s onwards, some things that are perceived as UFOs are ours. But, I would have to see far more evidence before I went down the path to say that, that some people believe that there are fleets of UFOs hidden somewhere and fake alien invasion is going to be put in place, to put us all under martial law. I mean, for me, that's the more extreme angle of conspiracy theorizing, and, I don't personally hold with that unless somebody one day comes up with something solid. But the concept of our UFOs and somebody else's, I think that makes sense, because as our technology develops, the things we're flying are going to change. Look at all these little drone things. If somebody saw one of those 10 years ago, they'd swear they'd seen a UFO. Today we know different, but they still look weird,
Mm-hmm. Well, and, I think the government putting us under martial law or some kind of, I don't think they need UFOs anymore. I think they're coming up with enough other reasons that, they could just decide, we're going to do that tomorrow, and we'll just be stuck with it. But that's a totally separate conversation, and one that I don't know that I want to have on air. So, yeah. It's really sad when you sit there and you talk about stuff that's going on in the government, and you're kind of fearful about just having a frank and honest discussion about it on air.
Well, I mean, for the most part, everything I do, I'm happy to discuss it, because for the most part, I use, like with this book, I use documents that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act. In other words, what I do, although some of the material is extraordinary and bizarre, it's all been legally and lawfully obtained through the FOIA, through the Freedom of Information Act. So everything in my books, there's no problem me talking about it, because it's all stuff that agencies have declassified, through the provisions. The people who, of course, get into trouble are the ones, the WikiLeaks of the world and people like that, because of the approach they've taken. So, anything in my books is fair game, simply because it's come from the government archives, and they're the ones who've decided what files we can see and what we can't. It's not like, anything in the book is a document that's sort of like from shadowy sources. No, they're all
right.
official documents. So, yeah.
No, but I saw a picture recently of somebody holding a sign that looked like it was like a fence post sign that came from Area 51 or some classified government, if you cross this line, you could be killed. One of those kind of signs. Yeah. And I'm like, and you would put that out in public, because now they have your name and your face and you holding this sign. And and that's part of the fear thing. How much is the government, snooping into us and our lives and interfering? And if you're doing something that they're not liking, will you have a knock on your door? And that even actually kind of goes into that fear thing. Are we being paranoid? Is this really going on? And is there something for us to be afraid of?
Well, yeah, and I think the important thing is that, that there's debate about all this sort of stuff. It's like, regardless of what's going on or what isn't going on, I think the important thing is to have sort of referendums and debates on it as to, where is the line, so to speak, and I think that's an important issue. Instead of just sort of arguing about this or arguing about that, is this going or isn't it? Try and find a way to actually have a forum to see what is and how much is justified and what needs to be done versus does this really need to be done, Oh,
I agree. It just seems, and I'm just going to, put this out, that it's really hard to figure out what's true and what's not true, because there's not a whole lot of transparency, or it doesn't seem like it.
No, and I think, there's, and I'm sure this sort of debate goes on at an official level as well. There are people who think, well, we need to do this, and other people, somebody else might say, no, that's overstepping the mark, and somebody else might say, well, we need to find a middle ground. I think, a lot of people who write about sort of the things I do, they sort of perceive like the government as some sort of, when I say the government, I mean any government around the world. I'm just using like terminology of the government as like some huge monolithic body where everybody's in accord with everybody else. But these people, they're not shape-shifting reptilians. They're everyday people with families and lives, and they do the same things we do, contrary to what certain conspiracy theorists might say. And I'm sure that conversations go on inside in the same way that they do with us outside, And so for that reason, I think it's an awkward situation, because you need, in today's world, which is a strange world, you need balance, and we need to sort of determine what's okay and what isn't, and what's justifiable and what really isn't necessarily necessary,
It's not necessarily necessary.
Yeah,
okay.
That's a good title for the book.
Really. So I'm kind of going to go back to where we were before, and talking about, and I don't know that I asked you this or if we covered this topic, but do you know if the government has ever actually captured or found or caught any cryptoids?
Well, there've been long-standing rumours that after the explosion of Mount St. Helens, the volcanic eruption of Mount St. Helens in May 1980 in Washington State, that, when the explosion occurred, it was like a huge disaster. It sent sort of plumes of smoke, hundreds of tons, literally, of smoke and dust, thousands of feet into the air. It blasted away an entire part of the mountain. And the outward blast actually travelled at no less than 250 miles an hour. That gives you some idea of the force and power involved. And Mount St. Helens is heavily forested, and it has a long tradition of sightings of Bigfoot-type creatures, which actually go back to Native American times, so, centuries. And what we know for sure is that more than 60 people who refused to heed the warnings about leaving were actually killed. Some of them just vaporized, when the explosion occurred. And we know that roughly around about just over 1,000 elk were estimated to have been killed, and just thousands of smaller animals as well. Well, what happened was, of course, the regular emergency services went out to give as much help as they could to the human survivors. You had a lot of like veterinarians and animal emergency services went out there as well, and military agencies. They came on board to help as much as they could too. And in the wake of the explosion, or the detonation as such, say the eruption, we've had rumours from probably somewhere in the region of 12 to 15 people have come forward now, claiming to have been military personnel who were either on site in the aftermath of the eruption, or who heard stories from friends and colleagues of large sort of Bigfoot-type bodies being airlifted out of the area in strong nets by double-rotor military helicopters and taken away for autopsy at military installations or whatever. Now, I talk about this in the book, but I also stress the fact that although the stories are fascinating and the people who've interviewed them are satisfied with their credentials, nobody from the official world has gone on record to say, I'm Colonel John Smith and I oversaw this autopsy. They're all whistleblowers and unnamed people. Now, that doesn't mean, that there's nothing to it. I mean, you have to remember, like Deep Throat in Watergate, he turned out to be a real legitimate person and the story was correct. So Deep Throat whistleblower-type sources, in relation to the military autopsy of Bigfoot, it doesn't necessarily mean they're just a bunch of fantasists. But what it does mean is that that's as far as we've gone with these stories. And I stress that. They're fascinating, they're intriguing, but we've sort of reached a brick wall, and if I had more on it, I would put it out. I'm not sort of secretly sitting on the testimony of Colonel Smith. I just, I have as much as, or as little as anybody else, and we just are at that brick wall stage when it comes to, the idea that maybe the military has autopsied a Bigfoot. But it's kind of like with stories of, alien bodies in cryogenic storage 40 feet below the surface of some military base. There's plenty of those tales like the Bigfoot ones, but again, we don't have any hard and solid proof, So I think these stories are going to sort of circulate and be talked about for forever and a day, unless something surfaces where we can say yes or no for sure.
And I can kind of understand why they would keep UFOs and aliens under wraps, sort of. Anyway, I'm not even going to go there. But I don't understand why, if they found a Bigfoot and autopsied and whatever, that what the issue tied to it would be. It wouldn't be an issue of national security. It would be a new species unless they were intelligent. Now, I could see that being an issue, but I really don't understand that.
Well, my view is that the reason, I can really only see one reason why, if official agencies did find the body of a Bigfoot, there's only one reason I could see why that would be something to hide, and that is if, as I suspect, Bigfoot isn't just an example of an unknown North American great ape. If it is, it would just be the zoological find of the millennium. It would change things overnight, but it would still not be an issue to be kept secret. I can only assume, and it is an assumption, I have nothing really hard to base it on, but I suspect, based on the various stories that we have of people who've seen Bigfoot and occasionally been visited by official sources, I can only assume that these agencies suspect that Bigfoot is something more than just a flesh and blood animal, and they want to know what it is and where it comes from. And I think that possibly would be the only reason to provoke such secrecy.
Right, there's that, but if they could figure out that these things were actually intelligent, it would disrupt our own egotistical assumption about who we are on the planet too. It's like, wait,
Well,
there's this other intelligent species.
Yeah, and it would also, I think, have a spiraling effect with things like religion. You know, I mean, for people who sort of uphold 100% to this belief or that belief and interpret 100% literally, you know, the idea of us being made in this image, you know, well, what about if these are a type of human? Well, whose image are they made in? You know, it would open up all these awkward doorways to even more awkward questions, and I think that could have something to do with it as well. The idea that admitting the existence of Bigfoot could have a spiraling effect on other issues, as I said, like, you know, evolution, religion, all these different ideas. You know, what is a human or what isn't a human? You know, or how many types of humans are there? All of this sort of thing might be perceived as being too troublesome to, you know, open the door if you're not able to shut it again.
Mm-hmm. You know, it just makes you go, wow. We come back to that whole religious angle and belief and the level of control it has over our ability to look at our world from a realistic point of view.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, from my perspective, I mean, I've had a few weird experiences that lead me to believe that I actually do believe that some essence of us or energy or soul, however you want to term it, I actually do think something survives bodily death. But that's a long stretch of saying you have this simplistic approach where, you know, you have one place where it's all clouds and harps and the other place there's this guy with horns and a pitchfork prodding you into a fiery pit. You know, to me that's too simplistic, and it's like controlling people through fear and guilt. But in the same way, you know, there are numerous religions around the world, but a lot of them are conflicting. You know, some religions believe only humans have souls, but I once had a very weird experience after one of my dogs died, which I truly do believe something came back. Literally like an overpowering wet dog smell suddenly out of nowhere. I mean, that literally did honestly happen. So, you know, if one religion tells you only humans have souls, how do they explain that? You know, other religions believe we just go somewhere else and we stay there. Others believe we recycle, you know, like reincarnation. So what we have is a widespread belief that goes back as far as we go back, that something survives death. But I think over time, the fact that we don't understand it, and we'll never know till we actually reach that point, has led various religions and bodies to interpret it, not necessarily from a manipulative state in the first place, but they've tried to understand it and created their own belief systems, and somebody else has created their belief system, and then it creates rival factions, and then they go to war with each other. You know, and that's the problem. It's not. I don't have a problem with the idea that something survives death and there could be other realms of existence. I have a problem with one religion saying we're 100% right and they're 100% wrong, so they've got to be taught otherwise, you know.
Well, and the joke is they're all praying to the same God, you know, but they can't agree who that, you know, it's kind of crazy making. You know,
well, yeah, I mean, it's like one person's idea of God is an old man with long hair and a long beard and a flowing robe, in the same way that one person's view of the devil is he's bright red with horns and a forked tail and a pointed nose. Well, you know, that to me is sort of cartoonish, and I don't mean that as blasphemous for people who believe this or that. It's an image that's been created. Now, that doesn't take away the fact that, you know, there's so much in our world that seems designed, you know, to the point where it doesn't just seem random. And so there could well be some sort of original creator. I actually think that there is, but it's how you define what a creator is. Is it some sort of energy? Is it like the equivalent of like a biological supercomputer? Or is it some individual, all-powerful entity? You know, we just don't know. But you're right. I think, you know, there is something to be said. You can put the thought out there and ask for something, and it will come back to you. You know, some people will call that praying. Somebody will call it channeling, you know. But I think it works. But as I said, what I have a problem with is not the concept of any of this. I have a problem with somebody being 100% sure they're right and being 100% sure that somebody else is wrong.
So we have a question from the chat room, and it's from, and I don't know how to say his name, but you should feel honored because I can't tell your name. Durhuff, Derhuf, however you say that. Durhuff. One of my biggest fans. And his question is, do you believe in reincarnation?
I'm not sure if I believe in reincarnation. What I do believe, and I think this could explain reincarnation, is the idea of inherited memory. Now, I'm sure everybody knows these stories where, somebody has a heart transplant or something like that, and suddenly afterwards, or the weeks afterwards, they start getting a craving for food they'd never eaten before. And then when they look into it, it turns out the person they had the organ from used to live on this particular food, or it was their favorite food. And there are other cases where people had organ transplants, and they've had dreams and weird nightmares that seem to be linked to the original memories of the person whose organ they had transplanted. So that's like an inherited memory. And, I think I won't say there's evidence, but there is enough stories to suggest that maybe, in the same way that we look like a little bit like our mothers or fathers or grandparents, maybe we inherit some of the memories of the people who came before us. So possibly, at least some cases, might be related to the idea of, you think you're reborn, but what if you're picking up on an inherited memory very deeply in your mind of when your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather in the 1600s, was present at, a witch trial or something like that, and saw it, and then you assume you're a witch in a past life, that kind of thing. I think that when we know that the whole organ transplant thing will pick up on possibly inherited memories and things like that, I think that could possibly offer, a reasonable explanation. The only problem I have with stories of reincarnation is not so much the idea that it couldn't happen, but why is it always somebody was an Egyptian princess or a Roman leader? Why wasn't somebody just the guy who cleans up, the cow dung or whatever, Why are they always...
Hey, I had a past life doing that.
Oh, that's more credible than actually, somebody said, what were you in a past life, Nick? Oh, I was King Arthur. Why couldn't I have just been a guy who tended the fields and dropped dead at 60 or something, That's the only thing. I'm not being cynical, but that's one of the things I find troublesome about a lot of these stories. The person they were reincarnated from often had this amazing life. Why couldn't they just have a boring life,
But see,
like
I've done some past life regression work. I was, got my hypnotherapy certification, so we were practicing on each other. And that was my past life. I was in India, and I was an elephant pooper scooper. I swear to God. And my life pretty much existed around, I had to go on my knees on these like basket things behind the king's elephant and pick up poop. And there was two of us. And there was this whole thing of viewpoint that I knew I was better than, my position. And I just felt so oppressed. And it was interesting because I kind of changed my perspective and looked at myself being this Indian pooper scooper guy. And what I saw was an Indian pooper scooper guy, and it was just really bizarre. But no, I don't understand the 500 Cleopatras and the,
No, that's right. That's where I have the problem. But I mean, who knows? I mean, the very fact that some religions do believe, which go back a long time, that we do sort of recycle, so to speak. I mean, I can't say it's not possible. I would never say that because we're dealing with what are, without doubt, mysteries. And when somebody says, I know this is true, and I know that's not true, when they're dealing with the paranormal, well, they're not speaking truthfully. They're making an assumption, or they're trying to force feed a particular theory, on one particular person. And I think that's where the problems stem from.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to change topics here because I want to talk about this before we run out of time. Mermaids. Talk to me about mermaids. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, I saw that documentary thing that they had on TV, and I was just like, whoa. And I was like taking notes. I swear to God. I watched it twice. I took notes, wrote down the names of all the scientists because I'm like, I am getting these people on the show. And then I tried finding them, and that's when I started finding all of the flack about it. But I won't talk. I'm going to kind of give it to you. What was with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this was a show. It was actually first aired in May 2012. The first one, there's actually been a sequel on the Animal Planet. It was called Mermaids, The Body Found. And it was actually a spoof documentary, but it was actually done very well. And the scenario was that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is known as NOAA for short, which is a real legitimate agency of government, the story was that they'd uncovered evidence that mermaids really exist and had decided to hide the truth from the public. Now, in the show, the mermaids, as I point out in the book, they don't look like hot Daryl Hannah in the movie Mermaids, the movie Splash, I mean. They're not described like that. They're sort of described as like savage, gruesome fish people, kind of like the creature from the Black Lagoon. In other words, they're not curvy supermodels with the bottom half of a fish. They're literally like human reptiles, as I said, straight out the creature from the Black Lagoon. And the story was in the show that they evolved millions of years ago and went into the oceans, and over time lungs became gills, and they developed web fingers, and were highly savage and dangerous animals. And the government had decided to hide the facts from people for fear of, people. Nobody would go in the ocean again. People would live in a state of fear, and so they decided to keep it all hidden. That was the essential premise of the show, and it was actually done really well. The special effects were CGI, but they were pretty good, and it did leave a lot of people thinking, what the hell is this all about? Is it real or is it a spoof? Well, the reality is it was a spoof, but a lot of people were quite angered by the fact that they felt they were deceived rather than, as I think was probably the idea, was to get people thinking about the concept of it, but the realization, I suppose, that the show's creators hoped that people would realize it was a spoof, but a lot of people didn't. They thought this was like a piece of investigative journalism, and this organization's work had been sort of uncovered. Now, it's been pointed out that the theory of sort of real-life mermaids, and I don't mean, as I said, the Daryl Hannah type, but the idea that millions of years ago, perhaps an offshoot of the human race did go underwater, it doesn't necessarily indicate that theory. The theory is known as the aquatic ape theory, and it does sort of posit the idea of underwater humanoids that possibly live permanently under there, or that are mammals that can they only have to surface very now and again, unlike us, if you're swimming underwater or whatever. So although the show was a spoof, there are people who still stick to this idea that there could be something to the theory of mermaids, even if it's not like the traditional image that we have from, sort of cartoon shows and movies or whatever.
Well, I mean, like I said, I watched that show twice, and they never posted a disclaimer that it was. But somebody said, because I had put something on Facebook, and somebody said that it had originally aired in Australia or something, and it was very clear that they had put a disclaimer up. And so it was only when it was here in America that they didn't do that, which was annoying.
Yeah, it was bizarre, because it was that thing more than anything else had people confused. If there was like a statement at the beginning saying, this show is intended as something just to get people thinking about the idea of mermaid, that's totally different. But there was nothing, and it did confuse a lot of people, and they weren't sure what it was they were watching. I wasn't sure at first, but then I just thought, with the act, there was something about the character. I don't think they came across totally as, non-fiction people, so to speak. They came across, I think, there was a little bit of that where it seemed like it was acting. And so for that reason, I kind of looked at it through cynical eyes, so to speak. And what was very strange, though, and kind of ironic was that the real NOAA organisation, which I said a real group, shortly afterwards they put a statement out on their website saying no evidence had actually ever been found that mermaids existed. And within some conspiracy circles, people were saying, oh, well, that's NOAA actually protesting too much in the sense that they really had found something and the show had made a spoof documentary, not realising that actually hit on a real hidden truth, in some ironic situation. So then you had that idea that there really was something along those lines going on, and that's what led NOAA to put out this denial that anything had ever been found. And I don't personally hold to that. I think NOAA probably anticipating the fact that they might get a lot of calls and emails asking if it was true, so they just decided to make it easier for people by putting a statement on their website. But you can understand why some people in the conspiracy field might think, they were trying to play down the fact that they actually really did know about genuine mermaids.
But there also had to have been obviously a lot of research done to have produced this thing in the first place, because it seemed very realistic, that somebody had done their homework and they were presenting good information. One of the things that was misleading because one of the main scientist guys, I don't remember what his name was, actually did have a web page, supposedly. And the web page was taken down by the Department of Homeland Security. That was on the screen, when you pulled up his web page. And it was, so there was a whole bunch of controversy around that. It's like, he had a web page. Well, but I like to dig into stuff. And so I went into the Wayback Machine, and that website had only been up for like a month. So it wasn't even a real website.
No. Well, I didn't know actually about that angle at all. I hadn't heard about that. But I mean, it is kind of strange, that a TV show should be broadcast on a mainstream channel, kind of, putting fabricated words into the mouths of, if it was an invented agency, didn't really exist, that's one thing. But they're actually, putting fabricated and invented words into the mouths of a legitimate government agency, which is kind of an unusual thing, not so much for the show to be done, but actually for a channel to go ahead and broadcast that. You know what I mean? I just found that kind of unusual.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you think there's evidence of, other than the show, do you think there is evidence of mermaids? I mean, I do believe that according to mythological sources, that there were these, semi-aquatic, whether they were wearing some kind of suits and lived in dry, underwater cities or whatever, creatures, but what's your take on the whole mermaid angle?
Well, I mean, if you look at it from the perspective that they're presented in the show, where they, as I said, they look nothing like Daryl Hannah, unfortunately, but they actually look like something straight out the creature from the Black Lagoon. Well, within history and folklore and culture, you can find creatures like that all throughout history. I mean, the most recent example is probably the famous stories that go back to the late 80s of the so-called lizard man. These sort of bipedal, 6 to 7 foot tall lizard-like creatures. And then, you've got the whole reptilian angle of the UFO phenomenon, the idea of like some sort of aquatic or reptilian creature, which actually is not dissimilar to what was shown in the show. And you go back to the 15 and 1600s and find reports of humanoid fish-like creatures. And again, it's kind of like with fairies, were there small people or little people who lived deep underground, tribes of people hundreds of years ago? Maybe. But the image we have today is of like little female characters with wings. But that's actually a relatively modern view of how they looked. And maybe it's the same with mermaids. We have this image today of, like I said, the top half looks like a super bottle, the bottom half looks like a mackerel or whatever, And I think it could be something like that maybe there really are humanoid type creatures that live in the oceans or lived and could be responsible for some of these stories about reptilians and lizard men and all sorts of things. But they've been morphed over the centuries by mythology and folklore into something that appears very different.
Mm-hmm. well, I just think that, that was why I was so intrigued with that documentary, because, there are so many mythological sources. They don't call them mermaids, but there's definitely this, intelligent aquatic creature that is able to, or had been able to, interact and communicate with mankind, which makes you go, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, if you type into a search engine, aquatic ape, and aquatic ape theory, you'll find reams of material on this particular scenario of how and why it's quite plausible that there could have been an offshoot. It's not quite the same. You look at penguins. Penguins are birds, but you either see them waddling along very awkwardly on the ice, or they're very skillful swimmers. When they're in the oceans, they can dart through it, like a bullet being fired. And they've adapted to living in the oceans, but they're birds. Birds are mammals. We're mammals, so it's not out of the question that a humanoid creature could develop there, that, if it lives in isolated pockets, that could potentially hide from us and just be occasionally seen and be interpreted as the image that people have as mermaids and that most people roll their eyes at. But, if you're talking about something that is an evolved humanoid, roughly our shape, but distinctly similar, then distinctly different, then that is not sort of implausible, I think.
But it seems like there's a lot of creatures that are in the oceans that we don't really even know about, or at least that's my belief, that, the ocean is the vast unexplored, and there has to be stuff that we don't know about. If we can't find Bigfoot and he's on dry land, it just seems like there has to be other things, like giant serpents or giant squid, or whatever that live there.
Well, yeah, a lot of people don't realize how incredibly deep, like the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic oceans are in certain places. And, most of us, 99.9% of us, have no way of ever getting to those vast depths, short of having like a submarine, which, unless you're a millionaire or you're sponsored by some big university or you're the military, none of us have the ability to travel to these depths and look for these things, never mind have the money to spend 6 months doing so. So from that perspective, it's no wonder we don't find evidence. And of course, the other fact is the sheer size of the oceans. You would really have to be in the right place at the right time to come across these creatures. And if, there's a colony of 20 or 30 of them, at an incredibly deep depth, well, you just won't find them. If they're fish of some sort, they're going to derive their oxygen from the water, through the gills. They might need to never surface, in which case the chances of seeing them are even slimmer if they don't have to surface, and maybe they only surface out of curiosity now and again. So it doesn't surprise me, the idea that there could be maybe surviving creatures from previous eras like the Jurassic period, or possibly even creatures that have evolved around the same time as us, but we don't know anything about them. We haven't found fossils of them because they post-date the sort of fossil era. We just don't know anything about them at all. So I'm quite open to the idea that not just the possibility, but the probability that there are things like that down there.
Well, and there are people that talk about like the aquatic ape theory, where at one point in time in our evolution, mankind actually spent a lot of time in the water, and that's why we have the webbing between our fingers. That's one of the reasons why we lost our body hair, because it made us more, I'm going to say aerodynamic, but that would not apply to water. Streamline. And a number of other features, our ability to hold our breath, which led to our ability to talk, things like that. And it wouldn't even be that long of a stretch to take that to the next level and say that even a branch of those decided to stay in the water, kind of like dolphins and whales, which were at one point in time land creatures or mammals. They're mammals.
Yeah, they're mammals. And dolphins are a classic example because they're highly intelligent. We can interact with them, and yet they live in the ocean, and so that's an example they're obviously not a human offshoot, but it is an example of a highly evolved, skilled animal that interacts with us, that seems to enjoy being around people, or has a link with people, a connection, and they're fully identified. So it's not out of the question at all, I think. And of course, it's sort of in our nature innately to be able to swim. I mean, I don't recommend anybody does it, but, God forbid it happens, somebody drops a baby in a swimming pool, that baby will start swimming. That's a fact, that they start kicking their legs, and if they go under the water, they come to the surface. So it's deep in our brain somewhere. There's something that, links us to water, and we're familiar and easy within it,
Well, and humans are the only species that have infants that have a lot of body fat, that make them be buoyant. So, I mean, there's just these things in our physiology. I really like the whole aquatic ape theory in the general sense of the word. It just seems very congruent to me, much more congruent than we climbed out of the trees. That one never...
It may have been maybe a combination of everything, I mean, some apes and monkeys, spend their entire lives, up in trees. Others, spend time on land. So, I mean, like chimpanzees don't really like water. We do a bit of both. We live on land, and when we go to the beach on holiday, we get a tan, and then we go and swim about in the water. So, it's in the ape world, in the monkey world, in the human world, in sort of the primate world. There's a sort of variations on how we react to water. So, we spend some of the time in it. Chimpanzees don't like it. There could well be another offshoot that just loves it,
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm looking at the clock. We got a couple more minutes. Are there any other creatures that have been recently found, or that were thought to be extinct but ended up actually fooling everybody and still being around here?
Well, yeah, I mean, the most famous one probably is the coelacanth, which is this large type of fish that grows to about 8 or 9 feet long, which prior to the 1930s we only had fossilized remains, and it was presumed to have become extinct literally tens and tens and tens of millions of years earlier, until 1938 when one was actually caught off the coast of South Africa. And since then, there have been quite a few other coelacanths either caught and captured or caught and filmed and released. Now, the oceans are much bigger, obviously, than the forests, but a fish of 8 to 9 foot long is comparable in size to a Bigfoot of 8 or 9 feet tall. And yet people were sure up until the 30s that there were no coelacanths. They were fully extinct. And actually just recently, a small species of horse, which was believed to become extinct tens of thousands of years ago, was suddenly found again. So, it's possible that other large creatures could, have survived extinction. We don't know about it. I mean, one of the areas that fascinates me is that although, the woolly mammoth was perceived as becoming extinct around about the time of the last ice age, sort of 10, 12,000 years ago, there are reports suggesting that maybe in isolated parts of like the former Soviet Union and places like that, mammoths may have survived up to like 400 or 500 years ago. Now, I know that goes totally against the grain of what science and history and zoology tell us, but there are reports of people seeing hairy elephants and things like that, even up to like 100 or 200 years ago in really remote parts. And who knows, maybe the last mammoth really didn't die out that long ago. I don't think there's a chance of them being around now, but, with DNA splicing with elephants, maybe they'll come back. But I actually do think there's a probability that they lived far longer, than we're led to believe.
Oh, I guess I missed a question. So, yeah, I got time. And so this is from Lisa in the chat room. And it says, what about aliens living in the oceans? Reading a book on USOS right now. Lots of very strange stories.
Well, that's actually really a good question, because there's a lot of cases like this. I mean, a man named Ivan Sanderson wrote a book about this called Invisible Residence, which looks at this particular theory, sort of classic book that, the idea that at least part of the UFO phenomenon at least might not come from up there, but it comes from down below us, or visiting aliens are sort of permanently on our world, but they've set up sort of huge installations, kind of like, that a James Bond villain would have or something like that. I mean, I'll give you an interesting few stories. I've been on a number of expeditions to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabra, and every time I've been there, which is now 3 times looking for the chupacabra, I've heard stories of UFOs seen coming out of the oceans off the coast of Puerto Rico late at night. And these particular stories all have sort of a similar theme, the idea that there are sort of underwater installations off the coast, and that these things have a permanent presence in that area, which possibly explains, some people believe, not just the UFO presence, but the chupacabra presence as well, that it's all interconnected. So there are actually a lot of stories like this of USOs, underwater submersible objects as they're known, people seeing them. And I mean, this has also given rise to what's called the crypto-terrestrial theory, a term coined by the late Mactonis, who wrote a book called The Crypto-Terrestrials, which is a very good book because it sort of approaches the idea that the UFO phenomenon could be related not to aliens, but to a very ancient terrestrial race that went underground thousands of years ago when we started infesting the planet. And maybe they lived not just sort of in deep caverns and caves, but deep in the oceans. That was one of the theories that Mac addressed. So I recommend Mac's book as well, The Crypto-Terrestrials, because all of this data, like Sanderson's and Mac's, it kind of, presents this idea of, not just weird creatures under the oceans, but whole civilizations that we know nothing about.
Well, and that, I always find this interesting, and I don't really consider myself like a UFO person per se, but when you start looking at this mythology and then you start, hearing about these underwater civilizations and underground civilizations, I mean, they talk about it constantly over and over and over and over in myth that are thousands, 5,000 years old, and older. And it just makes you go, okay, if they were talking about it back then and we're still talking about it now, can't there be some kind of reality to it? Isn't there some kind of reality?
There probably is. I mean, I always say that, where there's smoke, there's always a bit of fire. And it's like with any legend or myth. It may well have been distorted over the centuries, but there's generally some sort of truth behind a legend, even if it's down to earth or it's still paranormal, there's some truth. And when you get stories from all around the world of cultures, seeing these beings come out of the oceans, and sometimes they're highly advanced and they try and teach the primitive people, about science and technology or wisdom or whatever, and, these nations are poles apart, but they're telling the same thing hundreds or thousands of years earlier, then you've got to begin to wonder, or see at least like a pattern developing in some respects.
Exactly. So our time's almost up. What's up for you? I mean, new book coming out next week, which you'll probably say, oh, yeah. Conferences, what's up with Nick?
Well, I'm speaking at the conference called the Paracon Conference in Kansas City in September, and I'll be at the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis in October. And I'm working on a couple of books, another cryptozoology book and also another book on the Men in Black mystery. I've done 2 books on the Men in Black, but there's so much data and cases and theories that I'm working on a third one now. So hopefully in the not too distant future, both of those 2 will appear. So.
Within weeks, I'm sure, of each other.
Maybe with each other, that's possibly, but not a couple of weeks from now. Even I can't.
Well, no, I didn't mean a couple of weeks from now, but a couple of weeks from each other. Anyway, Nick, great conversation. Always love having you on. So you just need to keep me informed. New book coming out.
I will. Yeah. I will.
All right. So.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on again, Rita. Had a good time.
Well, thank you so much, and I will talk to you again soon.
Alrighty. Yay. See you later, Rita.
All right. Bye, Nick. That's Nick. That's Nick Redfern. His webpage is www.nickredfern.com. His new book is Monster Files. And next week, wait a minute, got to get to the right page or I won't be telling you anything. Oh, next week is going to be a really interesting show because we have a Dr. Michael Witzel coming on talking about the origin of mythology. And this guy is like, looking at his bio here real quick. He is the president of Oriental Studies at Harvard University. Really super smart guy. I'm looking forward to this conversation because we're going to be getting into some heavy duty. So bring your brain machine with you. And then in the second hour, we're going to be speaking with Kane Carroll about the mudras of India. And if you don't know what mudras are, listening to the show, it's a very interesting concept that I was just introduced to recently. Look it up, but it's going to be cool because it's going to cover art and mythology and spirituality. It's going to really cover a lot of different areas. So that's next week here on Just Energy Radio. And so until next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser